Havenburg, New Year's Eve. The streets gradually emptied as rolling metal shutters closed one by one, giving way to the silence of the night. The last buses rumbled away, carrying travelers back to their hometowns for the holiday. But amidst the glowing city lights, there were still those who had no bus waiting for them. Philip stood motionless at the bus stop, a small suitcase resting by his feet. No buses stopped. No familiar faces appeared. He knew he had nowhere left to go. He once had a happy family, until a tragedy 3 years ago took everything from him. Now all he had left was a cramped rental room, an unstable job, and memories that still hurt. For him, New Year's was no longer a time of joy, but a torment. Not far from where Philip stood in a small alley, Nancy sat by the fire, grilling the last skewers of meat. It was the same every year. She had no one to return home to. Her only son had left town long ago and never once came back. She told herself that selling a few more skewers would mean a little extra money to get through the lonely New Year days ahead. In a cramped old rental room, Mia, a young waitress at a small eatery, quietly picked up her phone, only to set it down again. She couldn't bring herself to call home. This year, she wasn't going back. After being scammed, she no longer had enough money for the trip. Her family still believed she had a good job in the city, but in reality, she was struggling to get by each day. A few streets away, Martin, a weary old motorbike taxi driver, was still riding through the night. He had once had a stable career, but the hardships of old age had forced him onto the streets to make a living. He knew there would be no more passengers at this hour, but he kept riding anyway, as if it were the only way to escape the loneliness closing in on him. At midnight, these strangers unknowingly crossed paths in a small eatery. They didn't know each other, yet they all shared one thing in common. None of them had a place to go. Philip stepped inside and ordered a bowl of hot noodles. Nancy, having finished her sales for the night, sat down and asked for a cup of tea. Mia curled up in the corner of the table, while Martin nodded off beside a glass of rice wine. The owner, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, observed them for a moment before speaking softly. "This New Year, everyone seems to have their own sorrow, don't they?" No one replied, but slowly their eyes met, drawn together by an unspoken understanding. And then the conversation began. In the small eatery nestled in the heart of the city, the clinking of chopsticks against bowls mixed with the soft hum of an old radio playing a familiar spring melody. But the four people sitting together at that table had no mood to celebrate the new year. The owner, Tony, a man with graying hair, slowly poured more hot tea into the cups. He glanced around the table, his gaze lingering on each of his guests. "Each of you here tonight carries a story of your own, don't you?" No one answered right away. They remained silent, as if those stories had been buried too deep, too painful to unearth. But then, as if drawn together by an invisible thread, an unspoken understanding connected these strangers. The first to speak was Martin, the old motorbike taxi driver. He reached into his pocket for a cigarette, but put it back, letting out a heavy sigh. "I once had a happy family," he said, his voice hoarse. "But because of one mistake, I lost everything." Martin had once been a government employee. His life was stable, not wealthy, but comfortable. He had a son, Henry, smart, respectful, and full of promise. Martin had poured all his hopes into his son, dreaming of a bright future for him. But then one ill-fated business investment with friends changed everything. Martin was deceived, and in a single night, he lost all the savings he had built over a lifetime. Yet even more devastating than losing the money was losing his son's trust. Henry argued with me. He said I was no longer worthy of being his father, that I had ruined his future. That night, Henry left home. For years, Martin searched for his son, but there was no trace of him. As time passed, Martin's life crumbled. He lost his job, fell into hardship, and eventually became an old motorbike taxi driver, wandering the streets, hoping that one day, by some stroke of fate, he might catch a glimpse of his son in the bustling crowds. Every New Year, I ride through the city, hoping to see him. But 10 years have passed, and I still haven't found my boy. A heavy silence settled over the table. No one spoke, but in their eyes there was a quiet, sorrowful understanding. Mia bit her lip gently, her hands clasped tightly together. After a moment of hesitation, she finally spoke. I once had a happy family, but I lost it. She lowered her head as if she didn't want anyone to see the pain rising in her eyes. Mia was born into a poor family in the central countryside. Her parents were farmers, working tirelessly year-round, yet still struggling to make ends meet. When she was accepted into university, it became her family's greatest source of pride. But life in the city was far harsher than she had imagined. To afford tuition, Mia took a part-time job at a financial company, unaware that it was actually a predatory loan operation. She was tricked into signing papers she didn't fully understand and was later forced into working as a debt collector. When she realized the truth, she wanted out, but they wouldn't let her go so easily. They threatened her family. To protect her parents, Mia had no choice but to drop out of university, flee her hometown, and cut off all contact with her loved ones. "I still want to go home, but I can't," she choked out. Nancy, the eldest among them, watched Mia quietly. "You're afraid that if you return, you'll bring danger to your family, aren't you?" Mia nodded. Once again, silence filled the room. Their stories slowly unraveled, layer by layer, like petals swept away by the wind. But this was only the beginning. Philip looked at the people sitting around him, then took a deep breath. "If everyone here has a story, then so do I." All eyes turned to Philip. He took a deep breath, staring down at the bowl of noodles that had gone cold in front of him. For the past 3 years, he had carried a story within him, one he had never dared to speak aloud. "3 years ago, I had a family." Philip's voice grew heavy. "But I was the one who lost it." He looked up, his eyes filled with torment. "I had a wife and a child who never had the chance to be born." The words froze the air in the small eatery. Mia frowned slightly and Martin tightened his grip on his cup of tea. Philip's story was clearly more than just an ordinary separation. "Her name was Lana," he continued, his voice softer now. "She was the love of my life. We got married after 2 years of dating, and when she told me she was pregnant, I thought it was the beginning of a beautiful life." He let out a bitter smile, one that carried nothing but pain. But then, one mistake took it all away. Philip had been a construction engineer. His job was stable, his income secure. But during a large project, he had been deceived into signing a fraudulent contract by his colleagues. When the truth came to light, he was the one held responsible, fired from his job and left to face an overwhelming debt. "I worked day and night, desperately trying to pay it off. But the more I worked, the deeper into debt I fell. By the time I realized it, it was already too late." Lana, his wife, had been 8 months pregnant, but Philip had been too consumed by work to take care of her properly. "I promised to take her to a prenatal checkup one evening at the end of the year." His voice trembled. "But that day, debt collectors showed up at my work site, demanding payment. I couldn't leave in time." His hands clenched into fists. "She went to the hospital alone and got into an accident on the way." The room fell silent. Both my wife and our unborn child didn't survive. Nancy covered her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. Martin bowed his head, while Mia turned away slightly, as if trying to hide her emotions. "I blame myself every single day, every single hour. I lost everything, and I can never go back to that house." Philip stared down at his hands as if he could still feel the weight of the past. "That New Year's Eve, I couldn't bring myself to return home. I wandered the empty streets, just like I am now. And for the past 3 years, I haven't once set foot back in that place." No one spoke. The old radio continued playing a festive New Year's melody, but for the 4 people sitting there, the spirit of the holiday felt like a distant memory. 4 people, 4 stories, and 1 shared truth. None of them had a place to return to. Nancy finally broke the silence. "I once had a family too, but now, there's no one left." The others turned to her. Her voice, weathered with age, still carried the weight of old memories. "My son left for the city over 10 years ago. He used to say he'd come home every New Year, but year after year, I've been alone." She let out a sad smile. "Maybe he has a new family now, a new life, and no longer remembers his old mother." No one knew what to say. After a long pause, Martin sighed. "We all carry our own sorrows, but tonight, maybe we're not so alone after all." Philip looked at Martin, then at Mia and Nancy, and in that moment he realized Though each of them had their own struggles, at least tonight, they had found something else: understanding. On New Year's Eve, 4 strangers sat together, sharing the pain they had never voiced to anyone else. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new. Outside the small eatery, the streets were eerily quiet. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., only 15 minutes left until the new year. 4 strangers, each carrying their own painful story, had found temporary comfort in each other's presence. But just then, a knock on the door echoed. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking was urgent, as if someone was in a great hurry. Tony, the owner, furrowed his brow and stood up to open the door. A cold gust of wind swept in, accompanied by a young man, his face frantic. "Excuse me, can anyone help me?" The man was panting, his clothes caked in mud. He held a small child, around 3 years old, whose face was pale. "The boy has a high fever. I don't know what to do." Nancy immediately rushed over, touching the child's forehead. "He's burning up. He has a high fever." Mia panicked. "Is the hospital nearby open?" Martin shook his head. "At this hour, it's probably difficult, but we need to take him right away, or it could be dangerous." Philip jumped to his feet. "I have a motorcycle. I'll take both of you to the hospital." Without another thought, everyone rushed outside. On New Year's Eve, in a city that seemed so cold and deserted, they raced against time to save a tiny life. The hospital had closed its emergency intake for the night, but fortunately, a doctor was on duty. The child was quickly taken into the emergency room. The young man, the child's father, paced restlessly, his hands clenching and unclenching. "Thank you, everyone. If it weren't for you, I don't know what I would have done." Martin patted his shoulder. "It's okay. But what were you doing out on the streets at this hour, carrying your child like that?" The man lowered his head. I've been unemployed for months, and I couldn't afford to pay rent. Tonight, the landlord kicked me out. I only had time to grab my son and run." His story left everyone speechless. Once again, they saw a fate like their own. People pushed to the brink by life's hardships. Nancy's voice trembled. "Where's your wife?" The man gave a bitter smile. "She left a long time ago. It's just me and my son now." At that moment, Mia looked closely at the man's face. She suddenly froze, startled. "What's your name?" He looked at her, surprised. "I'm Henry." A second later, Martin stood frozen, his whole body stiffening. That name, the one he had been searching for all these years. "Henry! Are you Henry?" His voice trembled. The man stared at Martin in shock. In an instant, his eyes widened. "Uncle, you are..." No one could believe their eyes. On this chaotic New Year's Eve, after being separated for 10 long years, father and son were reunited in the most unexpected of circumstances. No one spoke for a few minutes. Martin slowly walked over, his old hands trembling as he touched his son's shoulder. "Henry, is it really you?" The young man looked at his father, tears welling up in his eyes. He choked out, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Father and son embraced each other, crying in the hospital hallway. Nancy quietly wiped her tears. Mia was also moved, unable to speak. As for Philip, he suddenly realized something. Perhaps there was still a chance for him to fix his own mistakes. Outside, the sound of fireworks erupted. A new year had begun. But for the people here, perhaps what mattered most was that they had found each other. The hospital on the first morning of the new year was still quiet. Soft sunlight filtered through the glass windows, casting gentle rays down the long, silent hallway. Henry sat by his son's bed, holding his little boy Ben's hand tightly. After a long night, the fever had subsided, and the child was now sleeping soundly. Martin had not left. All through the night, he stayed by his son's side, as though fearing that if he let his guard down for even a moment, it would all turn out to be a dream. Mia, Philip, and Nancy also stayed. They had welcomed the new year together in the hospital, but none of them felt lonely anymore. Henry looked up at his father, his eyes full of regret. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything I said all those years ago." Martin shook his head and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I don't blame you. I just regret not being able to protect you better." They exchanged a glance. No more words needed. After 10 years apart, all the bitterness had faded away. In the corner of the hallway, Mia hesitated as she looked at the phone screen. Her mother's number was still saved, but it had been 5 years, and she didn't dare to make the call. Nancy walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "My dear, you can't run away forever." Mia bit her lip and took a deep breath. Her hand trembled as she pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times. Her heart raced. What if her mother didn't answer? What if her mother refused to listen to her? But then, the familiar voice came through. "Hello?" Just that one word, and Mia's tears began to flow. "Mom, it's me." On the other end, her elderly mother seemed to freeze for a few seconds. "Mia, is it really you?" Her voice trembled. Mia broke down in tears. "I'm sorry, Mom." No one knew what the mother and daughter spoke about after that, but when Mia turned back, her eyes were red, but a light, relieved smile had appeared on her face. Mom said, "If I can't go home, she'll come to the city to visit me." Nancy smiled softly and gave Mia's hand a gentle squeeze. "Then you're not alone anymore." Meanwhile, Philip stood on the hospital rooftop, gazing toward the distant horizon. Ever since hearing Martin and Mia's stories, an unfamiliar feeling had stirred within him, something urging him to do what he had been avoiding for the past 3 years. He took out his phone, opened his contacts, and found the name of someone who was no longer there. Lana's number, his wife's, was still saved, even though 3 years had passed. He typed a message. "Lana, I'm sorry. I've run away long enough. It's time for me to face the past. I'm coming to visit you and our child." He knew the message would never be sent, but somehow he felt lighter. Nancy stood quietly at the hospital gate, watching the stream of people passing by. She had no one to call, no one to reunite with, but as she looked at the people around her, Mia, Philip, Henry, and Martin, she realized she was no longer alone. A gentle breeze swept past, carrying a hint of warmth from the first day of the new year. She smiled. Perhaps this new year won't be as cold as the ones before. The sun had risen high. A new year had truly begun. Martin, Henry, and little Ben left the hospital, ready to rebuild their family. Mia awaited her mother's arrival in the city, prepared to face past mistakes and start anew. Philip gathered his courage and for the first time in 3 years, returned to the home where he once had a happy family. As for Nancy, she decided to stay in the city and open a small restaurant, a place where those who couldn't return home would always have somewhere to gather during the new year. 4 people, 4 lives, 4 wounds of the heart. But after that fateful New Year's Eve, they had found something far more important. They had found each other. The new year is not always a joyful time for everyone. Some are unable to return home due to their circumstances, while others choose to hide from the pain of the past. But no matter where we are, if we open our hearts, we will always find people willing to share and walk alongside us. If you know someone who is alone this new year, don't hesitate to reach out. A kind word, a warm meal, or simply a little time to listen to their story can make all the difference. Because sometimes even the smallest moment can change a person's life. Have you ever experienced a lonely new year? Share your story and help spread the warmth.